Hi there. My name is Hughes-Castleberry, and I'm going to be giving you a short, probably like 30 or 40-minute presentation on science communication in the wake of COVID-19. Science communication is something that's really important and something that I have been studying as I'm finishing my master's degree in science communication. And so I just thought I'd share with you some of the things I've learned. And feel free to take notes. I'm also going to be sharing my email at the end of this presentation if you want to contact me. So who am I? A little bit about myself. I'm a podcaster, a writer, and a digital specialist. I do digital work, so I currently work at 2 marketing firms and do social media and social media research for both of them, as well as podcasting. Those are my 2 podcasts below, Young Scientists, where I've interviewed young scientists around the world and asked them what it's like to be a young person in science, and Human Angle, which is all about the hidden lives of scientists and making them more human and less celebrity figures. You can find both my podcasts on Spotify if you're interested in listening to them. I'm more importantly a CSU alum, so I graduated literally last year in August with a double major in English and biology. I had a lot of help, specifically from Liz Hyson, who you might know in your class, and she just really helped me move forward. And by odd coincidence, I met someone else at CSU, Mary Swanson, who helped me to move forward into the science communication realm because I wanted to do a lot of science writing. And so science communication was the next big step for me. So I ended up moving across the pond to Imperial College in London, lived there for 6 months, and then moved back when coronavirus hit in March. So I'll be telling you a little bit about that. I am a social media expert, as I mentioned, so I just recently finished an internship with Botanic Gardens Conservation International and got to speak to a bunch of botanic gardens around the world. And I also worked at the Denver Botanic Gardens before I graduated at CSU. I've worked a bit in radio and been to the BBC and worked with them a little bit. That's the picture in the top right corner that you're seeing is the BBC studio for their podcast Digital Planet. One of my professors in London works at the BBC, so I was able to get a little bit of supervising from him. I've also done a TED Talk and have a YouTube channel, so please feel free to find me on that if you want. Those aren't really my big highlights. I always like trying to one-up myself in a sense, so if you think that's shocking, I'm sorry. Also, I am an archer, a runner, and an adventure junkie. So I like doing archery. I have a bow and I go out and shoot all the time. Colorado's perfect for that. And the bottom left picture is me and my boyfriend, and we're doing whitewater rafting. So yeah, outdoors, that's kind of my big thing. All right, switching topics though, because you're not here to hear about me, you're here to hear about science communication. So, science communication, every time I told people I was majoring that, they'd be like, well, what is that? What does that mean? And science communication pretty much, according to Wikipedia, which we're never supposed to use, but we do anyway, is the practice of informing, educating, sharing wonderment, and raising awareness of science-related topics. So it's pretty much just sharing sciencey, nerdy stuff. Science communicators and audiences, you don't really have to define them. And of course, expertise and like who's the expert or who's the scientist is going to vary in your group. Sometimes you'll have scientists talking to the public. Sometimes you'll have science communicators talking to the public, journalists, documentaries, things like that. The science communication jobs, if anybody's curious, or maybe wanting to go into science communication and just not sure where to start. This includes things like documentary makers. You could be the next David Attenborough, you never know. Podcasters like Radiolab. Professors, obviously, bloggers, something I do, scientists, journalists, writers, and of course, there are many other things you can do in science communication. It's something that is just really, really important to have within the sciences period, is being a good science communicator. So I thought I'd start by sharing my story of being in London in March when COVID hit. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what I was doing. So I originally was still studying when coronavirus hit, and my classes immediately went to online. I stopped seeing my professors, I stopped seeing my friends. And of course, talking to the few other Americans in my program, as well as friends I had made there who were American, there was a big fear about the borders closing in the United Kingdom and me not being able to get back home. So, there was, of course, the mass panic of getting toilet paper, supplies, quarantining yourself. But for people in other countries, such as me, it was the fear of, well, I won't be able to go back to my home country. And the healthcare system in the UK is quite different from the US. The healthcare system is nationalized, which just means that you don't always have to have insurance to get healthcare, as opposed to here in the States. And while that was something that I thought beneficial, I would have rather, spent the money to go back home and be in the healthcare system that I was comfortable with and the country I was comfortable with, than wait it out and see if it would get any better or worse. Of course, in March, nobody knew what was going to happen. It was just on the rise. People were starting to get really scared. So I ended up looking for the first plane ticket I could and booking my way out of there. And of course, getting to the airport was a little weird, because the airport was deserted. The security was turning away even Canadians without residency, from going in the States. So, they really emphasized having that American passport. Of course, me being like everyone else, I wiped down everything, brought hand wipes with me. And so, yeah, all 4 Americans in my program, myself included, ended up going back to the States because we just didn't know what was going to happen. Nobody knew. And of course, when you get back home, they take your temperature. They ask you, do you have any infections? Have you felt really bad? Have you been coughing? And then after that, I had to quarantine myself for 2 weeks. So I ended up just staying pretty much in a room in my house for 2 weeks, and just, spending time in quarantine, which was a very strange experience, but still really good. And it made me think more about how COVID-19 is being communicated. So, the US, COVID-19 has been more politicized than the UK. The UK also has had coronavirus be politicized, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for the US, it's more about our policies, what we've been doing, social distancing or lack thereof. And so, it is really interesting from an international perspective to see how the two change in science communication. And that's something as science communicators we should look at, is how globally is something being communicated, such as vaccines, coronavirus, climate change, global warming, things like that. So COVID-19 has really changed the way society works, and it's a big question of how we're going to communicate in the future. And so I wanted to talk about how science communication has worked with coronavirus, worked against coronavirus, the different influences on COVID-19 communication, and what that looks like. But first, let's do a little bit of basics. So in science communication, you have framing, narrative, and audience. These are, of course, a few of many things you should be thinking about as a science communication. I can't even talk today, as a science communicator, but it's very important to think about these 3 things. So framing is just, according to Wikipedia, comprises a set of concepts and theoretical perspectives on how individuals, groups, and societies organize, perceive, and communicate about reality. Gross, right? Long sentence. Pretty much framing is just a device used to tell a story. So, the example I have here is acts of violence are being framed as terrorism, or vaccine being framed as a wonder drug. You're often using framing to encapsulate a story in a certain thing. So you might have, like, let's say COVID-19. You might frame COVID-19 as a fire. You might say, oh, the spread of the COVID-19 fire, virus, whatever, that sort of thing is a frame. So framing you'll find a lot in the media, specifically within science, just because a lot of media journalists are not scientifically educated. And of course, some of the concepts that they're communicating to the public are very, very difficult to understand. Things like theoretical physics or neuroscience is just something that, may not be something that people can easily grasp. So to frame it in a way that makes it easier for people to understand is really helpful. And so you'll find that a lot in the media. Narrative is a little different from story. From framing, narrative is a story. It's pretty much an account of a series of related events, whether that's true or fictitious. For science communicators, of course, we're usually telling true narratives, and we're using that to tell stories within science, such as science biographies of specific scientists, personal struggles, laboratory reports, you name it, things like that. So for me as a podcaster, I use narrative all the time because one of my podcasts goes into the biographies of certain scientists. So I'll use a narrative to tell a story about somebody like Nikola Tesla or Marie Curie. And narrative is something that really, really helps with that. So you'll also find narrative a lot in science communication, and use narrative to help frame a story better, whether it's a personal narrative, whether it's the story of somebody else, that sort of thing. So the example I have here is, of course, stories of people who have survived COVID-19, such as, of course, Tom Hanks or Rita Hanks, the actors, or who have lost loved ones to COVID-19. That's another type of narrative. And then, of course, audience. As any communicator or writer should know, audience is really, really important. And so what we look at is target audience, whether that's elementary school students, your professors, or other scientists, or even just your peers. Knowing who you want to communicate to is extremely important, because that's how you're going to frame your writing. So you wouldn't use the same language in a lab report as you would in a Snapchat to your friends. You'd make it a bit more professional, obviously. So target audience is really, really important as well when you're looking at being a science communicator, because you want to start with your target audience to begin your communication process. So you're looking at, okay, am I writing for the New York Times? Who reads the New York Times? Am I making a documentary about space? Who is my target audience within space? Is it space nerds? Is it NASA scientists? You know, things like that. So you want to be very, very, very aware of who your target audience is when you're communicating. So let's talk about framing of COVID-19. So as I mentioned before, a frame is, encapsulating a story. So specifically in the US, COVID-19 was framed by multiple media reports, as well as our president, as the quote unquote Chinese virus. And by this framing, it shows where the virus came from China. It started there, of course. But if we're looking at this like science communicators, we should look at the accuracy of that frame. Is that really accurate? And of course it's not. The virus actually came from animals, specifically bats, and not China or Chinese people first. Therefore, if we look at the frame of coronavirus as the Chinese virus, it is scientifically inaccurate and, of course, somewhat racist. So this is just one example of looking at how we can look at inaccuracy as well as ethics. Is that racist? Is that ethical? Of science writing and media framing, to look at how science is being communicated to specifically the public. So a little bit about COVID-19 versus the flu, because again, as the media has been communicating the science of COVID-19, quite a few media reports have also compared it to the flu. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at how that is being communicated and the differences between the two. So we have the lack of vaccines for COVID. Of course, as you are aware, CSU is currently researching COVID vaccines. And there is an ongoing race in research to find the vaccines for COVID-19. But of course, the ones that have been mentioned, ibuprofen, oddly enough, is one of them, gives inconclusive results. And so as science communicators, if we're communicating a story about vaccines, or if we're reading a story about vaccines, it's important to understand the science of the vaccination process, how vaccines work, who's developing them, what are the chemicals in the vaccines, as well as how the media is reporting them. Is that accurate? Are they using a scare tactic? Are they framing vaccines as some sort of device for stopping COVID-19? A lot of vaccines, as I'll talk about later, are framed as being wonder drugs or cure-alls, which isn't necessarily accurate. Of course, as well, we have recurring predictions of COVID-19, just like the flu. So experts have predicted, of course, a second wave of COVID-19. We're in the middle of that right now, and believing that COVID-19 will recur seasonally. Unlike the flu, however, our lives have been more majorly impacted by COVID-19 than the flu. But similar to the flu, COVID-19 has been showing to have different strains and mutations, like a virus usually does. So it's important as science communicators to look at the science of COVID-19, look at the science of viruses, mutations in viruses, which all of my biology students out there will understand what that means. So yeah, that's really important as well. And then, of course, looking at the death toll. So if you look at flu reportings currently versus COVID-19, there's more emphasis on death toll reporting for COVID-19 than the flu. Of course, when the flu first hit us, death toll was really, really important as well. And that's just showing kind of the media scare of, oh my gosh, people are dying from this disease. That's where they get started. So eventually, maybe when COVID dies down and becomes more normalized, it'll be like the flu, where we won't have as much death toll reporting. So, of course, with COVID-19 affecting our lives the way it has, there's more discussion about small businesses as well as individual country policies with mask wearing, quarantine, or social distancing, which we'll talk about in a minute. So let's talk about specifically vaccines and research in COVID-19, because that's, of course, pretty much where the science is coming from, besides viral diseases. So from wonder drugs to injecting chemicals, COVID-19 has really changed the way that we look at viruses, act around viruses, or just think about viruses. I remember when COVID-19 first hit London, I was working at a bookstore, and we had a book, a fictional book called Pandemic, that immediately sold out. And that's because people really saw COVID-19 as a pandemic, and it has been a pandemic. But that's just one example of how viruses have been communicated to the public compared to what they were earlier. So toilet paper scare and wonder drugs. Well, I think all of us remember that when COVID first broke out, people were rushing for toilet paper. I had a friend of a friend in London who bought 500 rolls of toilet paper for a family of 2. So again, the mass panic of toilet paper buying and other supplies was caused partially by how COVID-19 was being communicated to the public as this big, scary thing, an unknown virus with no found vaccines. People were getting really scared, or, emphasizing quarantine, staying at home and being safe was definitely more of that. I think as well, being combined with the death tolls and the rising death tolls, people would get scared. And the world had never seen anything like this before, in a sense, compared to like earlier. I think a lot of people compare COVID-19 to the Spanish flu back in the early 1900s. And that, of course, was the same sort of thing. Nowadays, though, we have Amazon and we have more digital stuff, so you can buy stuff online, which is a lot easier. So, but yeah, it's important to keep in mind how COVID-19 was first communicated versus now. Of course, there's still more outbreaks, specifically within the US, and of course, there's still rising death tolls and the rising number of cases. But you'll notice that the tones of the media are a little more hopeful and less panicked about things, as well as just less scare tactics are being used. So, now, of course, it's still scary. We don't know how a vaccine for COVID-19 might look, but we're not as scary, or people are not as, hoarding toilet paper as they were. So of course the race is still on for finding the research of a vaccine for COVID-19. And of course this is being framed by the media a lot as a wonder drug or a cure-all, which as a science communicator, we should point out that that's an obvious inaccuracy. There's really no such thing as a cure-all drug. And we need to, as science communicators, make sure that we understand how accurate the media is representing science within COVID-19. Another example, and this is where science and politics influence each other, is President Trump's suggestion of injecting chemicals into our bodies. Which shows just kind of how the media ran wild with that story and caused many Americans to think that that was actually a cure for COVID-19. I remember seeing multiple Instagram posts specifically of just major political leaders, but also just, global leaders saying, please do not inject your body with bleach, please don't do this, please don't do that. Which also, again, that mass panic of thinking people were going to do this could be caused by media communication. So it's one of those things where we really have to pay attention to how the media is communicating certain things, as well as looking at all angles for the story and the target audience. Who is this being communicated to? What are they saying? Is this scientifically accurate? So a little bit more about science and politics. So specifically within the US, we have the politicization of mask wearing, which is where mask wearing has become more politicized and less about the science of COVID-19. You'll see on the right here, there's a protest sign that I found on the internet, specifically somewhere in the southern US, where people are holding up signs that show that masks are a symbol of governmental control. And while, of course, the governments and state governments have put up laws about social distancing and mask wearing, and businesses have said, you can't enter without a mask, the science of mask wearing and viral disease isn't actually, political. It's being tainted by the political climate of the US, especially in an election year. So it's another thing as science communicators that we need to look at, is how the science of mask wearing and, coughing and spreading disease is being tainted by politics, specifically within the media, or in protests. And other countries really don't have this issue. If you look at the UK, if you look at somewhere like France or even Africa, they're not going to have the same sort of issue that the US does about politicization of mask wearing. So we do need to look at that as science communicators. Where is that coming from? What can we do as science communicators to communicate the accuracy of science versus the politics? And just know that pretty much all science being communicated is going to either have some sort of influence on it, whether it's politics or ethics or money, something like that. There is something to be said for that, the pure science from the laboratory of a scientific discovery being communicated out to the public may in fact be tainted somehow, whether it's by the journalist who doesn't know the science itself and can't communicate it as accurately, or whether it's by the public as well, running with that science and making it more political. You just never know. But as science communicators, it's important to understand that. So COVID diaries, this just means something that is more personal. So a little bit more about the public side, whether it's the rise in domestic violence, closing of small businesses, economic recessions, stories of depression, drinking, isolation. Our lives are never the same ever since COVID hit. And I think, for me anyway, looking at this as a science communicator, it's brought a lot more questions of science and research into the spotlight, but it's also brought a lot more acceptance of sharing mental and emotional trauma, as well as depression, loneliness, disability, or death into more of kind of a public domain, which I don't think was as open before. Of course, the younger generations have been shown to have more emphasis and importance on mental health and just checking in with each other and making sure, as opposed to older generations where mental health and the talks about mental health was more taboo. It is one of those things where COVID has brought that up even more and brought up even more questions about being home alone and the effects of isolation on children or teens or whoever. So many of the experts in science communication, specifically from my school in London, I've asked about how, COVID-19 is going to affect how science is being communicated. And many of them said that it's probably going to end negatively for the scientists. Many of them suspected that scientists are going to get blamed, specifically by political leaders, for not being fast enough or thorough enough in their research. So you may have a political leader who takes a really bad negative publicity campaign from a media source, and instead of putting that on themselves, they'll put it on the scientists and say, well, the scientists didn't give me enough data, so I couldn't make enough policies. And that's a science and policy issue. And it's important as a science communicator to understand that there is a lot of links between science and policy, and it's about how well informed you are in the science to do accurate policy and looking at the ethics as well. So it's just something to think about in the future, that perhaps after COVID-19 dies down and becomes more normalized, we may see more blaming of scientists in the future. So where do we go from here? I'm going to move this actually so I can read that a little bit more. So as science communicators, as we're looking at COVID-19, as we're looking at just kind of future possible other pandemics, possible diseases, but also just science topics in general, global warming, climate change, GMOs, something like that. It's important to be mindful of your target audience, who you're talking to. If you want to share, if you want to communicate, whether that's writing an article, whether that's talking to your parents, whether that's talking to friends, colleagues, professors, whoever, it's important to make sure you know your target audience. Are they your conservative parents? For me, my parents are very conservative. I'm more in the middle, but my parents are conservative to where they don't believe in vaccines. My mom doesn't like it when I get flu shots. And so I have to communicate differently to her the science of vaccines versus somebody else, somebody like my more liberal friends. You want to make sure that you're knowing your target audience and where they're coming from and their perspectives. If you're talking to a group of conservative Christians, know that they're coming from a different side than maybe a group of liberal Democrats. It's just important to know. Make sure no matter who you speak to, you balance both sides of the argument with enough information to show research on each side. So I think, and I'm going to put this in the perspective of climate change communication, but people really want both sides of the argument balanced. And I think that's good. You want both sides of the argument. Climate change exists, climate change doesn't exist, or climate change is human caused, climate change is not human caused. However, at least in the US, we have gone to the lengths, or some media sources have gone to the lengths of communicating climate change in a way that is inaccurate to the amount of research that there is. So there might be research, a lot of research on showing that climate change is human caused, and there might be only a few papers showing that climate change is not human caused. But certain media sources will make those two amounts of research look equal and say there's enough research out here to show both sides of the argument. You want to make sure, if you're showing both sides of the argument as a science communicator, that you are also giving the amount of research for both sides. So, in the case of climate change, you might say, well, there's a lot more research showing that climate change is humanly caused, as opposed to the little research showing climate change is not humanly caused, but here's both sides of the argument. That would be a good way of doing science communication. You want to make sure you're being ethical in your arguments. And by ethical, I just mean do the right thing. Make sure things are accurately represented, whether that's people's perspectives, people's lives, or a certain topic. The second thing we can do as good science communicators is be well informed, be well educated. So first off, you're going to college. That's a really good step in the right direction of being well informed. But do stuff outside of the classroom. Be good readers, be good critical thinkers, whether that's following the BBC News on Instagram. That's how I get a lot of my news. Or following the BBC World Service podcast, or following the NY Times on Twitter, or just get news sources. Become more engaged and well informed. So think about too, while you're reading these news sources, how are they framing the story? How are they telling it? What is their narrative? Who is their target audience? Start picking apart their stories a little bit as a science communicator and look at, is this accurate? My background as a biologist, do I know how vaccines work? Do I know how GMOs work? And would I agree that this story is accurate? And of course, finding reliable information is really, really hard, especially in the era of fake news, but it's very important for communicating well. If you want to be a good science communicator, you need to have reliable sources and good critical thinking, and be able to pull apart a story and say, here's the inaccuracies, here's the accuracies, here's how I want to communicate this story to my target audience in a way that I think would best represent the scientists, the research, the topic, that sort of thing. And also use your own story. And of course, this might sound difficult, scary, or weird, but it is something you can do to make a difference. And by that, I just mean, the era of COVID-19 has left us feeling more alone, isolated, and depressed. And the little things that you can do to make yourself feel more accomplished and just go out and do stuff, be more proactive and happy, are really big things in your life. And so, sharing your own story of how COVID has affected you, whether that's with friends, on your Facebook, on your Instagram, a blog, whatever, would, I think, really, really help to make you feel better, to make other people understand the pandemic, give it more of a human face, but also just allow you to have more of a critical thinking process. So whether you're talking about COVID-19 or any other sciencey topic, you can use a story, a narrative, to tell the information. And by this, I just mean that science and scientists and science writing have had the reputation in the past of really being jargon heavy, or that only smart people can do science because they have to have the jargon. And this really isn't true. We need to break down this reputation of science and scientists and show that, anybody can do science if you work hard enough. Anybody can be interested in doing science if you can put in the work and be well educated and well informed. I had this personally. I've had multiple people within either the English degree or somebody who's not an expert in science just kind of act different toward me when I was talking about something sciencey or nerdy. They would just be like, I don't really understand that, so I'm not really interested. And it's one of those, how are you communicating it so people can be interested and don't have to be kind of put off by big words or acronyms or whatever. So, but I also, when I was interviewing for my master's degree, I had an actual argument with a professor in Scotland about how, science can be done by anybody. And she thought it could only be done by smart people. And I thought, well, no, that's not the case. A lot of scientists haven't actually finished college that we heard about. Einstein didn't get his degree, Tesla didn't get his degree, and yet they're big names in science. So it just means that pretty much anybody can do science. And if we communicate science properly and ethically and look at it with a critical thinking lens, I think we can really break down that reputation of science and scientists. And that's kind of my goal as a science communicator, whether I'm doing a podcast or an article or a blog or interviewing a science writer. It's, how can I break down those barriers and make sure more people get interested in science? So one of the stories I wanted to talk about before I finish this presentation is somebody named Rachel Carson, which Rachel Carson, if you don't know who that is, first off, go Google her right now. But also, I would recommend highly reading her book, Silent Spring, which started the environmental movement in the 1960s. But also I would recommend the book, The Sea Around Us, which is another one of her popular books. Rachel Carson is a hero of mine. She's one of those people who started off as an English major, wanted to write about nature, loved nature, and didn't know quite how to fit within the world. She got her biology degree. She ended up working for the wildlife parks on the East Coast and just ended up seeing in the 1960s that insecticide was really killing off a lot of ecosystems and environments, and realized that nobody was speaking up about it. And so she decided to write this book, Silent Spring, which is all about the effects of DDT on ecosystems. And what happened is the book published, it became really popular. People started reading it and realizing insecticide was really bad, to the point where the US started the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and they banned the use of DDT in like a widespread case. So the ecosystems are actually saved in the end. Now for Rachel Carson, why most people wouldn't recognize her name is because after she got published, a lot of people, specifically the big chemical companies, really shunned her publication and said, she had shoddy research, she wasn't communicating effectively, whatnot. But, even if you get slammed by other people or thought that your idea was bad, her name will still land in infamy. And yours will too. It's one of those things where she took a stand, she took a fight, and because of that, we have a lot more nature than we would have in the world. So that's why I say, use your personal story. Even if it sounds weird, even if, you're laughed at or whatever, it doesn't matter. You never know what's going to happen in your life, and you never know whether somebody is actually going to need that story or not. So a couple other things I wanted to point out about science communication before I close is just a couple more kind of concrete definitions within science communication that I think would help you as communicators. First off is the transmission versus ritual types of communication. And this was proposed by a philosopher named James Carey. And transmission is just kind of a one-directional form of communication, which is what we commonly see in science communication. So it's scientists to public, or it's scientists to students. It's often from informer to informee. And unfortunately, the one direction method leaves out various perspectives and doesn't really take into account the audience's perspective. So, a white male scientist communicating the theory of evolution to, say, an African-American female audience might leave out their perspective or might leave out other perspectives and just have the white male perspective. So again, it's commonly used in science communication, and it's something that we should look out for, and if we can, try to eliminate and move to the ritual form of communication. And by ritual, it's just a bi-directional form of communication. So it's a conversation between informer and informee. So it's a back and forth, it's scientists sharing the science that they've discovered and the public giving their opinions on it, or the public asking questions about it. It gives multiple perspectives and puts the audience and communicator on equal footing. This form of communication isn't actually that common within scientists because it makes them feel uncomfortable or out of control, or just isn't part of the tradition that we've seen within scientists. So whether it's at a conference, it's a scientist speaking to other scientists or a scientist speaking to the public. We should, it's very one directional, and it's something that the scientists are more used to because it's got a historical tradition, or it just makes them feel more in control. And as science communicators, we need to emphasize more the ritual control or the ritual method because, we get more perspectives being shared between the two, audience and the scientist. And that'll help give more diversity within science, that'll help people appreciate science more, but that'll also help the scientists to better understand the impacts their work is having on the world around them. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was outreach versus inreach. So these are two different types of science communication besides the two models that we just looked at. So outreach is scientists and experts to non-expert audience, such as the public. So examples are things like Citizen Science Project, like iNaturalist, is something that I use, and it's a citizen science project where they track different populations around the world of plants and animals. So again, scientists, somebody had to build that. You have scientists working on that app, also public, just people taking pictures of plants and animals they're seeing. Documentaries such as Planet Earth, so the scientists writing the documentaries, adding footage, adding facts, and then the public watching it. Museums such as the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, the scientists creating the exhibits, giving all the facts in the exhibits, and then the public coming in and watching it. Podcasts such as Radiolab or Ologies or Scientists Not the Science. There's a lot out there of just scientists sharing their work on podcasts and then the public listening to it. And of course, science fairs that maybe a few of us did, where we were the expert and telling mom and dad about the science that we were doing. Inreach, oppositely, is scientist to other scientists. So whether it's peer-to-peer or expert-to-expert, things like scientific conferences or exclusive lectures for scientists to share their work to other scientists is another way that science is communicated, and is something that as science communicators we might not see that often, but it is still really important to look at, and it can really help to include diversity and appreciation within science. All right, that's the end. I promise you are done with me now, which is good. I've been talking for way too long. So I just wanted to share a few resources before I end this presentation. And of course, give you my email in case you want more information, in case you want to contact me and ask more questions, or if you're like, hey, Kenna, I really want some advice on starting a podcast, or, where should I look for more books, or who would you recommend talking to at CSU for science communication stuff? I'm happy to do that as well. But please also talk to the people running your course. They're going to have a lot more information than me. And of course, they are really well connected in the university. So just a few books I have here: Unscientific America. Cheryl Kirschenbaum, I'm actually interviewing next week. And of course, I've actually met her before. She's fabulous. This book is really about the current science communication within America and how Americans are being scientifically illiterate and how we can do things better to communicate within specifically a US audience. So I'd highly recommend that one. Randy Olson does these two books, Houston, We Have a Narrative, and Don't Be Such a Scientist. And both of them are fabulous. They're all about how science is currently being told, how we can do more storytelling within science. They look at some really cool case studies, such as NASA, and also just like science movies. So Jurassic Park's kind of the big one when you're talking about science communication. So I'd highly recommend those two. The Open Notebook is an actual website. So you just go to www.opennotebook.com, and it's a group of science writers and science journalists, and they have weekly postings of stories that people are sharing, or how to accurately write lab reports or communicate a certain topic. And it's just a really great community to join. So I'd highly recommend that. And then of course my email's here, and my blogcast is up here from the Bibliophiles. It'll be a podcast eventually, but this is where I interview science writers, really famous ones. So people like Deborah Blum, Brian Clegg, Catherine Harcup. If you don't know who any of those people are, that's totally fine. You can Google them later and read their books if you want. But I just talk to them about why they've written the books the way they have, their stories behind science, as well as how science is being communicated. So that is going to be it for this presentation. Any questions, please talk to your course instructors. And of course, you have my email if you want any more. Thank you for sitting through this. And I hope you learned something and that you really enjoy just having time to look at science communication.